Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's Dynamics 365 Tech Talk. Today's topic is Asset Management and Dynamics 365 Supply Chain Management, Acquire and Install Assets. My name is Michaela, and I'll be your moderator today. We are broadcasting this session through Teams live events, and the audio can be heard through your device speakers. This session is being recorded on behalf of the Microsoft Corporation. When you join this event, your name, email address, and/or phone number may be viewable by other session participants in the attendee list. By joining, you are agreeing to this experience. The recording will be available on the Tech Talks Community Dynamics page within the coming weeks. If you have questions for the presenters or need support, please use the Q&A panel located on the right side of your screen. Our presenters will be responding to your questions during the session and in a live Q&A segment at the end of the presentation. Thank you for your patience during these announcements. Presenting for us today from Microsoft, we have Anne Krupke and Alejandra Cabrales, Senior FastTrack Solution Architects, and Johan Hoffman, Senior Product Manager. Anne, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Michaela. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you're joining us from. Thank you for joining us today as we talk about the process of acquiring and installing assets in Dynamics. My name is Anne Krupke, and I am a Senior FastTrack Solution Architect on the SCM team here at Microsoft. You can see my contact information on the slide if you have any questions after this session or you want to reach out and connect with me on LinkedIn. And now I'll ask Alejandra to introduce herself.
Thanks, Anne. Hello, my name is Alejandra Cabrales. I'm Senior FastTrack Solution Architect for Dynamics 365 here at Microsoft. I have also added my contact information, and feel free to reach out if you have any questions.
Thanks, Alejandra. For anybody who hasn't joined us before, this is actually the third Tech Talk in our asset management series. We already covered the general module overview in September, and last week we did a deep dive on the new sensor data intelligence add-in, which also has a relationship with production control. Next month, we will have a session on setting up and executing maintenance on assets, and we are also planning to have a session where we talk about how you can integrate asset management and Dynamics field service, which will be scheduled soon. To view recordings of the previous sessions in the series, you can access the Dynamics community site. I'm not sure that Sensor Data Intelligence add-in is posted yet, but it will be soon. Now let's talk about our agenda for today. We will start by discussing the example we're using to drive our design decisions. Then we're going to go over to Alejandra, and she'll talk about how we set up functional locations to support the asset process. I'll take it back and we'll cover prerequisites for setting up assets in Dynamics, and then Alejandra will review and demo the process from a business perspective for acquiring and installing assets in the system. We will wrap it up with some additional resources and recommendations, and then we will have more time for Q&A at the end, although Johan has joined us today and will be answering questions throughout. So let's dive in with some background. First, to recap what we discussed in our introductory Tech Talk last month, the business process of asset management or managing assets is called the acquire to dispose process. And we can see some of the key functionality that's available in each of the general business process steps if we look at the high level functionality list in front of us. In this Tech Talk, we're going to be focusing on the acquire and install steps of the asset management process from a functional configuration perspective and a business process demo. As we mentioned in the introduction today, we will cover the maintain step in more detail in our next Tech Talk. Also in the overview session, we discussed some of the scenarios that you can use asset management for, which you can see on the slide here. It ranges from production equipment to managing customer assets to leasing assets. In this session, we're going to focus really just on the production equipment and warehouse equipment scenarios. If you have interest in deep dives in the other scenarios or more specific scenarios, please let us know in the chat or in the feedback survey, and we can look at adding that to our list of sessions. So for our setups today, our walkthrough, we're going to use the Purple Pillow Company as our example, which is a made-up manufacturer of bedding items who is live on Dynamics and wants to start using the asset management module. They have 2 production sites and a distribution site that are in scope for this implementation. At the pillow assembly site, we are doing discrete manufacturing and will need to maintain sewing machines, automated fabric cutting machines, and forklifts that they use for their warehouse operations. We will also need to maintain forklifts at the distribution site, and at the foam production site where we're doing process manufacturing, we have our foam dispensing machines, curing lines, and mixers. For the rest of this session, we're going to walk through all of the setups in Dynamics to support the Purple Pill Company's implementation of assets, starting with functional locations, which now I'm going to hand it over to Alejandra to review.
Thank you, Anne. Let's talk about functional locations. What are the functional locations? They are elements where you can track physical assets and manage the financial dimension association. If we move assets to a different location, then we can ensure that previous maintenance costs are allocated to the correct department and that the new costs are allocated based on where you are moving the asset to. You can also group work orders on assets in the same functional locations. For example, you could assign all maintenance work in one location to a single maintenance worker. And they also relate to inventory locations to drive spare parts forecasting and procurement. They may not be one-to-one matched with your warehouse locations, but we do tie them to the site and warehouse so we know where we are ordering to when we buy materials. There are several approaches to defining your functional locations. It can be based on grouping assets with the same behavior into a single functional location. For example, a location called forklifts. This would be a user-oriented functional location. You can have process-related locations, and this is when the functional location represents a process or department such as packaging area or a sewing area. Especially is when the functional location represents a geographical locations, sites, or warehouses. For the Purple Pillow Company, we have taken the approach to use some spatial locations at the top level, which relate to each site in the system, and have process-oriented locations underneath them to represent the sub-areas of each plant. As we show here, it is common for functional locations to have a hierarchy with multiple levels. In this picture, we can see our strategy for the Purple Pillow Company with our sites. Site 10, which is a pillow manufacturing plant. Site 20, which is a distribution facility. Site 30, which is our foam manufacturing plant. And each site will be divided into the process areas. For example, the pillow manufacturing plant will have 2 locations under the site location, which are for the manufacturing area and the shipping area. And under manufacturing, we split further into the cutting, sewing, and assembly areas. It is possible to move assets from one functional location to another, but the functional location hierarchy is not able to be changed after the fact. We can add locations, but we can't move existing locations to a new spot in the hierarchy. If you move an asset to a new functional location, the cost of maintenance stays attached to the original functional location. So the asset costs are always related to the functional location where the asset was installed at the time the cost was incurred. To start setting up your functional locations, you start by creating the functional location lifecycle states. They define the multiple states that a functional location can go through. For our example with Purple Pillow Company, we will have active, proposed, and retire. In our screen, we can see the configuration for the functional location lifecycle states. For active functional location, we set active as yes. For the proposed and retired states, we would not have them active. The Create Asset toggle button set to yes will create an asset automatically with the same name as the functional location and install it on the same during this lifecycle state. Sometimes the customers want to execute maintenance on a functional location, for example, a manufacturing plant, but you can do work orders on functional locations. So this feature allows you to create an asset directly related to the functional location for the purpose of doing maintenance on it. For this example, we will set that to no. You can set if you allow or not the functional location to be renamed. In this case, we don't want to allow it, but we will allow to create new sublocations. Also, in our configuration, we are only allowing installation of assets on locations with the active state and not propose or retire. And we will allow deleting functional location. You can turn this parameter on while you are creating your hierarchy in case you need to delete it. Next step is to set up the lifecycle model for functional locations. The lifecycle model is created by grouping the different states that will be part of the lifecycle flow. You can have multiple models, but for the Purple Pillow company, all functional locations can use the same model, so we don't need to have multiple. In this example, we have a different states that will belong to the standard lifecycle model of a functional location. This means that a functional location with this model assigned could go through these three different states: active, propose, or retire. Next setup is the functional location type, which is used to manage requirements for functional locations and its representation of the place where the asset will be installed. In this example, we have set up two types, area and site. In the area functional location type, we have set up the lifecycle model, which is standard. We won't also allow to have multiple assets on any locations that are type area. But in the site type, we don't allow multiple since assets should be assigned at area locations only, based on our business requirements. Since the financial dimensions on the asset should be updated based on the functional location they are installed in, we want to set update asset dimension to yes, which will drive this behavior. There are other details that you can set up for your functional location to make it more specific, based on your needs. You can specify asset types, maintenance plans, asset attribute requirements, parameter types, and attributes of functional location. Now let's move to the system to show how to create a functional location. To create a functional location, we'll go to the Asset Management menu, Functional Locations, or Functional Locations. Then we will have our list of functional locations. We have created a default location. This is just when the asset items are created and are assigned by default to this functional location. We can also see that we have some hierarchies. For example, the Denver distribution site is the parent of these other sites, the main warehouse and overflow warehouse. Here we can see the details of this functional location. It is a functional location type area. We can see the parent assigned, the site and warehouse. The lifecycle state is active. And you can also see that it has some installed assets. It has other details like asset attributes requirements, maintenance plans, maintenance rounds, address, workers, financial dimensions. So now let's create a functional location. We click New. And in this case, we're going to create another functional location for a new coding area following our naming convention. This will be a child for the pillow manufacturing area. We create the name for this new coding area. And we assign it under the main pillow manufacturing area. And finally, we assign it to the functional location type area. So we can see that our functional location is finally created. And we can open it to see the details and add more information if it is the case. Now I will hand it over to Anne to talk about asset data.
Thanks, Alejandra. Now that we have our functional location set up in the system, we'll walk through the setups that we need to be able to add assets in the system. First, let's review the list of assets that we have for the Purple Pillow Company. We can see on the slide that the assets we mentioned from the background section here are here, and we've grouped these assets that are similar into what we'll use as our asset types. We'll use this grouping to define default configurations and maintenance policies for assets of the same type. We will also have some multi-level assets in the foam manufacturing site, since we have 2 production lines, which each have a foam dispenser, a curing line, and a mixer. We want to use the parent-child asset relationship, since sometimes we'll need to take the whole line down for maintenance, but we will also sometimes do maintenance on individual assets as well. We'll show how we can see this relationship in the system when we get to the asset view demo. The first thing that we need to do is set up a few options in our asset management parameters form. First, we need to assign a default functional location that's going to be used when, as Alejandra mentioned, when we procure our assets and we need to assign them to a functional location. We created a placeholder functional location for this called default, and that is what we have assigned to that parameter. We also need to make sure that we have a standard calendar assigned that will be used for scheduling maintenance activities if we don't have a more specific calendar assigned. And finally, we can choose what our default layout of the asset view form will appear as. We'll explain what that form is a little bit later. I just want to point out that we have the option to choose which is the default layout. Next, we need to define our asset lifecycle states. This is a mandatory configuration to be able to track the current status of an asset. For the Purple Pillow Company, we kept it simple with a new, active, and retired step. And then we also had a requirement to add a specific state for assets that are in repair, which will be used when a machine has been taken to the maintenance department for an extended time for repairs. In the configuration for our specific asset states, the only additional parameters we need to define is whether an asset in that lifecycle state is considered active, and if applying the lifecycle state should prompt the system to delete any open maintenance schedule lines. So in our Purple Pillow Company example, when assets are assigned to the retired state, we will have delete open schedule lines equal to yes, and it will remove any open maintenance on the item or on the asset because it's no longer going to be in use. Once we've defined our lifecycle states, we need to set up an asset lifecycle model, just like functional location lifecycle models. This is going to define what the applicable lifecycle states are to a particular asset or asset type. Just like our lifecycle states themselves, the model is a mandatory configuration for using assets. In our example, we only needed one lifecycle model since all assets will go through the same 4 states. But if, for example, we're adding a scenario where we're also servicing customer assets, we may have a different set of lifecycle states that apply to those assets. And in that case, we would create another model to apply. You can see in the screenshot on the right that we have added for our standard model that we put all of the states we created under the lifecycle states selected box. and that the active life cycle state is the active state. Next, we'll set up our asset attribute types. Asset attributes are an optional configuration, but the reason we did it for the Purple Pillow Company is because they have requirements to track specific information about our assets that isn't explicitly defined as a field on the asset record. This is the purpose of asset attributes. And to be able to use those, we first need to say what the possible attribute types are and the possible values. The attribute type and description are manually added by you, and the values are going to be based on the business requirements, so the different attribute types that your business needs to track on different assets. Then you will select the data type that the asset attribute value will have, which can be decimal, integer, string, date, or yes, no. If you choose decimal or integer, you'll select the applicable units for that attribute type in the unit field next to the data type field, as you can see on the screen. If you're using a type of string, this is a predefined list of possible values, which you'll define by selecting that row for the string and clicking the values function at the top. And then you can manually define the options for that particular attribute type that can be used. The last 3 columns in this form show you for string types how many possible values there are, and then how many functional locations or asset types have this attribute applied to them. So just to clarify, as Alejandra mentioned, functional locations can also have attributes applied to them, just like assets. But in the Purple Pillow Company, we've only applied attributes to assets. The next mandatory configuration is asset types. And we're going to do this in the system. We'll show you the configurations we've done because it's a little bit more detailed than our previous configurations. To configure asset types in the system, we will go to the asset management module. We'll go to the asset management module on the left, and then under setup asset types, we'll select asset types. You can see here the different asset types we've created for the Purple Pillow Company, grouping similar assets together. Let's look at the sewing machine type. First, you can see we assigned the life cycle model for the states that are applicable to the asset types. That's standard. Next, the next option we have to define is whether we want to calculate the KPIs for that asset type as a total of the sub-assets. For most of our assets, that will be no, because they're all independent assets. But for our foam manufacturing lines, we do want those to be a total because this is the parent asset in our parent-child relationships. We wanted to use our KPIs as a total of the children assets. We can also see where this asset attribute is related to other types of records in the details fields on the top of the screen here. On the asset type, we have some additional information we can default. Maintenance job types that are applicable for assets of that type, counters that should be automatically applied to assets of that type. So for sewing machines, we've selected production hours and production quantity, which we'll talk about counters in just a second. We can also apply the attribute types that we just set up that apply to assets of this particular type. So sewing machines, we want to know if they're automated, what color they are, and how much they weigh. If we're using the condition assessment functionality, we can apply applicable templates to that type of asset as well. And then we can specify what the manufacturers and models are of that type of asset. And we'll talk about that setup in a little bit more detail in a second as well. We have an additional form called asset type defaults, which lets us provide even more default information of assets of that type. We can specify the default vendor warranty for that kind of asset and for a specific model. We can also say what the spare parts are. So for our sewing machine model, SewWet 100, there is a sewing needle spare part item that we define by default. And we can also specify maintenance plans on this level as well. So any asset of this type and model would be automatically applied to that maintenance plan. So that is all of the information. Asset types can help default on assets, which is really useful from a data governance perspective and applying policies in a more flexible way than having to do it on specific assets over and over again. So what we just saw in our asset types configuration were the application of asset counters. And here let's walk through the background setup, the configuration to use counters. This is another optional configuration in asset management, but in the Purple Pillow Company, we've chosen to use it because we're going to have them counters drive preventative maintenance and reporting on our assets. Counters are a tool to track certain information about an asset. In our case, we're tracking mileage, which will be used on our forklifts to drive maintenance, production hours, and production quantity, which will be used to drive maintenance on some of our production resources. We can also expose or review counter values through the production floor execution interface, which will show more in the maintenance session next month. For counter setups, the first key configuration is to define the units of the counter, and for production hours, we set that to hours. When an asset is linked to a production resource, we can automatically update production hours and production quantity counter values using production data. This would be set through the update field, which I'm currently highlighting. For all other types of counters, we will set the update field to be manual. As we talked about last week in our sensor data intelligence session, you can also use now IoT devices to update the counter values on your assets. Once we created the counter, we can establish which asset types will use that counter. We can also do that through the asset types form, which we saw previously. So for production hours, we will have our cutting machines and sewing machines using this as an applicable counter. Something else we saw when we talked about asset types and asset type defaults were manufacturers and models. This is another optional configuration that we can use to list the different asset manufacturers that we work with and their related models. First, you'll define the name and the description of the manufacturer, and then you can add the models and relate each model to the asset type it belongs with. So when you create a new asset, the list of available values will be filtered based on the asset type you selected. In this example, when we create a new asset of type sewing machine, the dropdown will show us that our only manufacturer is the Sew It All manufacturer, and then we can choose whether it's a Sew What 100 or 200 model. The last set of configurations we're adding to be able to use assets is criticality and service levels. You should have at least one of each of these in your setup for assets, although in our case, we have gone a little bit further with this. On the left, you can see the criticality types, which are used to identify which types of assets are more important or critical to our process and therefore should be maintained first. For example, in the Purple Pillow Company, sewing machines are one of our bottleneck resources, so they're going to have a higher criticality than, say, forklifts, which we have a lot of and won't hold up our production process. When you create criticality types, you will name them and then specify a factor, which is going to be used during the schedule calculation, and higher numbers in the factor would be a more critical asset. For each service level, which we can see on the right side of the screen, we will use this to define how soon a work order needs to be started and finished based on the time when the work order is created. For each service level, you'll set a value for what the start day should be by, and which is how many days were allowed between creation and starting the job. In the case for our urgent orders, which is the service level we're looking at right now, we want the maintenance to be started the same day that it's created by 5 p.m. So we set our start date to 0 and set the start time at 5 p.m. If we set the set start time parameter to no, then the start time will be equivalent to the time of day that the order is created. In the same way, we can specify when the work needs to be completed by relative to when the work order was created. For urgent orders, again, we'll set the expected end day to 1 day from the creation date by 8 p.m. Same thing with the set end time. If that's set to no, then the end time is going to be the same time of day that the work order was created. On the bottom right of the screen, you can see the example using our parameters that we have set. If we created a work order at that time, it would have needed to be completed by 10:25 at 5, or started by 10:25 at 5 and completed by 10:26 at 8. So it lets you validate your configurations. Once we added those criticality and service levels, we need to define how they apply to our assets. On the top, we can see our asset criticalities assignment. We have a generic line in the middle, which gives assets a criticality of 20 if we haven't otherwise specified. All sewing machines are given a criticality of 30 because, as we mentioned, they're a bottleneck, and forklifts are given a criticality of 10 since they are less critical to the process. When we're creating assets, the system, or updating, the system will look at the most specific combination of fields to apply the criticality, similar to how finding a trade agreement works. On the bottom, we can see the asset service levels, which are assigned similarly to criticality. For the Purple Pillow Company, all assets get a default service level of 3, which is medium, and sewing machines get a service level of 2 because they need to be completed on a faster basis than all of our other assets. Note that we can also set criticalities and service levels based on the kind of maintenance work that's being done, but we're going to go more into that in our next Tech Talk. Now that we configured all of the setups we plan to use for assets in the Purple Pillow Company, let's go back to Alejandra to show us the business process of acquiring and installing assets.
Thanks, Anne. Now we're going to see the process to acquire and install assets using purchase orders. We have two options when we are adding assets into the system. We can go to our asset list and click New to add a new record, or we can use a purchase order to buy and create the asset. We will focus on the second option in this scenario. We start by creating a purchase order, and we will create a PO line for a special item that is linked to the asset type we are buying. We will show this configuration in the next slide. Creating a PO for the asset will then automatically create what is called a pending asset in preparation for the asset's arrival. When the asset arrives, we will perform our product receipt posting as normal, which is optional based on your item model group settings. Then we will use the pending assets page to convert the pending asset to an active asset. We chose to do this after the PO receipt, but this can be done at any point in the PO process. Then we can fill out any information on the asset record. And once we are ready, we finally install the asset on the appropriate functional location. This is the form where you create your asset item. The item should exist as a released product as a prerequisite. We recommend that you consider using non-stock products for your asset items unless you want to have the system tracking the on-hand inventory of the assets. First, you will select the release product number that you want to relate to an asset type. Then you will enter the asset type for that item, as well as the specific manufacturer or model if applicable. Now let's show the process how to acquire and install an asset based on a purchase order. We're going to create a simple purchase order. We click New. I'm adding my vendor information, site, warehouse. Then I will add the item, which is the item that I want to convert into an asset. In this case, we will create another cutting machine. Then I confirm the purchase order. And now we're going to move to our pending assets sessions. In the asset management menu, assets, pending assets. Here you will find the POs that have an item that is related to an asset. As we mentioned, you can create the asset at any point during the procurement process. So you can filter the POs by status to see only those that are in the desired status to be converted into an asset. We have to mark the lines with the asset we want to convert. For that, we click on Edit, and we will be able to mark it. And then we can create our asset. And it will notify you that the asset has been created. Once it is created, we're going to be able to see it in our asset list. We go to our asset management menu and our assets. And you will see the asset item created based on the PO. We open it to populate more details on the asset. The asset was created with an ID automatically generated by the system, but you can always modify it to match your naming convention. Also, you can observe that the item that was created in a default functional location. We can see manufacturing info and model. You can add in model year and serial number if it applies. We also have the life cycle status active. And the work order with service level 3 and criticality 20 that Anne has previously set up. Below you have the details for the fixed assets. You can add the production resource and the fixed asset number. You also have the vendor information, and you could add vendor warranty details if it applies. You could add some other details like asset maintenance plans, functional locations maintenance plans, maintenance rounds, and financial dimensions. You are also able to attach asset documents, like a manual in PDF, for example. And you can check the asset counter, which was previously set up as production hours. And there's a lot of other information about maintenance that we will talk about in the next Tech Talk next month. In the General tab, we have other information like about spare parts in case we have some. And as a final step, we will install our asset. We click on Install Asset at a location, and we will choose the functional location of a cutting area. And now we can see that it has been assigned to these functional locations instead of the default. If we go to our functional locations, we search for our cutting area. and we will be able to see our asset installed. So now I will hand it over to Anne for closing.
Thanks, Alejandra. Let's get through some one last demo. So to recap the final result of our assets and functional locations being set up, let's go back to the system and use the asset view form to show what we created. To access the asset view form, we'll go to the asset management module. And under assets, we'll select asset view. This is a form that allows us to see a hierarchical representation of functional locations and assets. You can see the view defaulted to functional locations, but we have 3 other options. Again, that was what we set up in the asset management parameters to default the view to functional locations. And we can see the different locations that we have. And if we expand them, we can see the sublocations in the hierarchy. And if we expand further, we can see assets below those locations as well. If we click on an asset, we can see information about that asset, such as the manufacturer model, the asset attributes, and asset BOM information. We can also see our multi-level asset. So we have our foam manufacturing line 1 and the children asset underneath it as well. So the top level and the below level assets. So we just wanted to highlight that this asset view form is available and it helps you view that hierarchical relationship between functional locations and assets in your system and lets you look at information quickly and easily. Now let's recap some of the recommendations, the do's and don'ts that we talked about earlier in our configurations. First and foremost, and I think this is going to be the biggest one we ever say, is we recommend that you start simple with your setups and add details later. You'll notice with the Purple Pillow Company, we only had one lifecycle model for both functional locations and assets. We kept it really simple in terms of the number of states that we have, the number of asset types, etc. You can always come back and add more later once you get used to using asset management if there's more that you need to do. But the easiest way to get going is to start simple and come back and add later. We also want to remind you that the functional location hierarchy is not flexible once you've set it up. So you need to make sure you're planning ahead with what those locations should look like. Another area where it's really easy to get overly complex at the beginning and then realize you don't need all of that. You can always come back and add functional locations after the fact, but once you have a very complex hierarchy set up, you can't move it around and delete the functional locations if you've had assets installed on them. So really making sure you spend the time to get it right the first time with your functional location hierarchy, as well as the other setups in asset management. Kind of following that line, we recommend that you use asset types to support the asset data governance. If you remember when we reviewed asset types, we can default attributes, counters, spare parts, manufacturers and models, all sorts of information, and help you make sure that you're doing consistent data governance across assets of the same type. It's also going to make it easier for you to make sure every time you create a new asset, it's automatically added to things like preventative maintenance plans. And like we just talked about, we recommend that you leverage the asset view form. It helps you see that hierarchical representation of your assets and be able to work with them easily. In terms of don'ts, we don't recommend when you're getting started with asset management that you migrate retired assets into supply chain management. Typically, we recommend that you only migrate active assets into the system. We also recommend that you have more than one asset type, so don't have just one asset type unless you really only have one kind of asset. There's so much functionality that's tied to asset types that this is the one that you want to make sure you have multiple if you have multiple kinds of asset because they drive so much information. Don't leave assets on the default functional location. as Alejandra showed, when you create assets through a purchase order, they get installed in the default functional location. So you want to make sure you have a process to move them to their appropriate functional location for maintenance and reporting purposes. And finally, we also don't recommend that you set up the asset items as stocked items. We recommend that you do them as non-stocked items because then you won't have them as on-hand inventory, which could be confusing. It's starred because it's ultimately a business decision, but our recommendation is to set them up as non-stocked. Really quick, let's go through some additional resources and then we'll open the floor to any remaining questions that we have. First, we have created an AKA link to access the recordings for this Tech Talk series. It's aka.ms/asset management tech talks. There are a lot of Microsoft docs out there that talk about the asset management setups that we covered today, as well as the ones we will cover in the future. You can go to the asset management overview. And if you're curious about sensor data intelligence in particular, there is a home page for that on the module level as well. We also have learn paths for asset management on the Learn site, which are more self-guided training, complete with labs and quizzes. And we have the Yammer program. If you're looking to ask questions from other users or contact the product team, then you can use the asset management group on the Yammer program, or you can use the community site, which has the supply chain management forum with an asset management group as well. We always welcome your feedback on our product. If you have any that you would like to share, we recommend that you log them as ideas on the ideas portal and take the time to vote on other people's ideas because we use that to drive what we plan to add through the roadmap. So with that, I'm going to open it up. I'll start with Johan. Did we have any questions that came up throughout the presentation that we want to repeat here because they were really good questions? You're on mute if you're talking, Johan.
Sorry. There was a lot of good questions in the session. One of the last one, what does Asset Bomb do? And the answer here is that it shows the maintenance history of the asset with regards to spare parts used.
Absolutely. And we will show that in more detail in the next Tech Talk because we'll actually have been able to generate some maintenance history when we have those work orders in progress.
Yeah. Then there was a question, what is actually the difference between a maintenance plan and a maintenance round? There is actually not the big difference now. In earlier versions there were. You could only have multiple or create work orders with multiple lines from maintenance rounds, not the maintenance plans. You can do that now. Typically you'll use maintenance rounds to schedule kind of recurrent or intervals of maintenance. There's a restriction on maintenance round. You cannot make a maintenance round inactive as you can for the maintenance plan. But I think most customers can do with the maintenance plan.
Okay. Looks like we have another question. When you acquire assets through a purchase order, if the quantity is greater than 1, does it create the related number of assets or just 1? Alejandra, do you want to take this question?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, it will generate the number of the number of assets that the PO line has. Like if the PO line it contains 3 items, quantity 3, it will generate 3 assets.
Awesome. It looks like we had another really good question about functional locations. Can you set up functional locations as customer sites? And Johan, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, so what I took away from that is of course you could model a site as a customer site. Then you can kind of track the assets on that functional location at that customer. And as you know, on the functional location, you set the site and the warehouse. So that will also drive the demand, the material demand for that site warehouse. So if you, for example, want to use master planning, then you could create a transfer order between your main warehouse and your customer site to transfer the spare parts to that location.
Yeah, I think what I've seen with some people who are using asset management for maintaining customer assets is they'll have a top level functional location that relates to the specific customer. And then under that customer, they will have another level of locations for each of maybe their sites. And then they can even go further into buildings and floors if they need to track assets on a really specific level. So definitely you can use the functional location hierarchy to track customer locations as well as your own. Someone said, I have heard of advanced asset management. Can you explain the difference? Johan, do you want to take this one?
I cannot really add any information to that.
There's the asset management module that's in Dynamics was acquired from Dynaway, which is an ISV partner of Microsoft back in late 2018, early 2019. Dynaway has an additional product that they still offer called Advanced Asset Management, which works in addition to the functionality that you get now out of the box with Dynamics. So that is what I'm familiar with when people talk about Advanced Asset Management. There was another question, which was, can you acquire an asset through a production order?
Yeah, I just actually answered that. That is not possible. It's something we would like to support at some time to track kind of the asset from its birth when you produce it. But that is currently not supported.
Okay. Another question, with the purchase order, can we also integrate the fixed asset purchase and create the fixed asset and the asset in asset management with one purchase order line at the same time? Johan, do you know the answer to this?
Sorry, I was just reading another thread. Can you repeat?
So when we procured the asset on a purchase order, there's another, historically, when people are just using fixed assets, there's a process to procure a fixed asset through a purchase order as well. So what we're being asked is, can we combine both the fixed asset purchase and the asset purchase into the same purchase order?
I haven't tried that, but I don't think that is supported.
That's a really good question, though, and we can follow up on that.
Yeah, the first one is very old functionality that has existed way before we acquired asset management.
Right. So we do have the ability to link a fixed asset to an asset, but we would need to follow up on the ability to acquire them through the same PO.
Yeah.
Okay.
Something we need to test out.
Yeah, based on the questions we're getting, I think that we should have a follow-up session about the relationship between fixed assets and asset management. We have another question, which is, what is the recommended asset creation process when a fixed asset must be created as well? So another good question. We need to, I think we'll come back and maybe do an additional deep dive on that in the future.
Also, asset item has to be non-stocked items. Question mark. Can we use procurement category instead? I don't think so. Do you know that, Anne?
I believe it has to be a released product.
Yeah.
And it doesn't have to be a non-stocked item. You could use it as a stocked item. It just might be confusing to the business to see asset items as on-hand inventory because it's not something you can sell. It's not something you can consume in production. You're not going to want to do inventory adjustments on it or things like that. So it would be simpler to have it modeled as a release product that's non-stocked. But there's nothing requiring it to be non-stocked if you wanted to have it on hand. Okay, we have a follow-up from the chat that the last time someone tested fixed assets and asset purchasing in the same PO, it did not work. So it is a valid requirement, and thank you for that feedback. Where do we store the serial number, license plate, and other registration numbers for the asset? So we showed, in the system, in the asset module, that you can record the serial number of an asset on the asset form itself. If there's other more detailed information that you need to store, you can create custom asset attributes for additional like registration numbers as well. Johan, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I don't have more to add.
Okay. So there's a serial number field on the asset itself. If there's more information than that you want to track, you can create an asset attribute type for that information and apply it to that asset type. If I get an asset to maintenance through asset management, would this lock it to not be available in project management? I'm not certain what you mean by that. So projects are the financial backbone kind of asset management. So when we do maintenance work, such as using maintenance resources or consuming spare parts, that will be recorded on a project that's related to your asset, regardless of whether you click new asset or buy the asset through a purchase order. There's still going to be a project in the background that you're using to record the costs. But if there's another way that you use assets in project management, please clarify, and we can come back to that question. Okay. Are there any other questions that we have?
There was one. Is it possible to reactivate an asset for fixed assets that were reacquired?
I don't believe that there is any restriction on what states you can go between. So if the way that you update the state of an asset is to there's a button on the asset called Update Lifecycle State. And if you want to change it back from retired to active, then I believe you could do that. There is no configuration that says you can go from this state to that state, but not this state to that state. So I believe that it is possible. So the availability of an asset and its effect on a project timeline is what regarding the project management functionality with an asset. So this is where I would think about, normally we use resources, production resources. So when you want to use an asset, both to maintain it in asset management, as well as use scheduling for production capacity or project capacity, you would have an asset record in asset management and a resource record in the production control module. And you link those two together, as Alejandra showed on the asset record. So you're going to use the production resource to drive capacity of production scheduling, and you use the asset to drive the maintenance activities that you're going to execute. So even if you're procuring the assets in the process that we showed, you would also need to set up the resource manually in the system and then link those two together so that the resource can be used for scheduling. Johan, anything you want to add to that one?
No.
Okay. There was another question about the difference between Builtin asset management and Anata asset management, and I don't think any of us on this call are familiar with Anata.
No.
So
I'm not familiar with that, but for sure there will be differences if they have built some asset management capabilities.
Yeah, and they may be geared towards specific industries. A lot of times we see that with particular ISVs, they've designed that business process with certain industries in mind. Although again, we're not very familiar with that particular ISV. Okay, that looks like we've answered all of the questions. If you come up with any other questions, please do reach out to us. We put our information at the beginning of the presentation, and I'm going to hand it back to Michaela to wrap us up.
Thanks, Anne. I have posted a link to a short survey in the Q&A panel. We'd love to get your feedback on today's session and hear what you'd like to see in future events. Thank you in advance for your participation. As a reminder, the recording of today's session will be available on the Tech Talks Community Dynamics page within the coming weeks. And last, I'd like to extend a big thank you to our presenters and to you, audience, for joining us today.